The first knock came in the middle of the storm. The sound was so faint that Thomas almost missed it. The wind outside was howling like a wounded animal, and snow slapped against the old wooden walls of his cabin. He had just put another log on the fire when it came again, 3 soft knocks, slow and weak. He froze. No one ever came up this far in winter. He waited, thinking maybe it was the wind or a tree branch scraping the door. But then, a voice, a woman's, barely a whisper, carried through the howl. "Please, help." Thomas grabbed the lantern and unlatched the heavy door. The wind pushed hard against it, blowing snow into his face. A dark figure stumbled forward and fell into his arms. Her clothes were torn, soaked with snow, her skin pale as wax. He dragged her inside and kicked the door shut against the freezing air. The woman shivered uncontrollably, her lips blue. Thomas wrapped her in an old blanket and helped her near the fire. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Her eyes opened slowly, gray, hollow eyes that looked like they had seen too much. She tried to speak but only coughed. He fetched her a mug of hot water and lifted it to her lips. She drank in small sips, hands trembling. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin as paper. "Widow," she said. Thomas frowned. "What?" She met his eyes. "War widow." Then her gaze shifted to the door, fear tightening her face. "They're coming." Before he could ask who, the second knock came, louder this time. Thomas reached for the rifle hanging by the wall but hesitated. The woman shook her head slowly. "Don't," she whispered. He opened the door again. One by one, 11 more women stepped out of the blizzard. They were thin, wrapped in coats that barely held together, eyes dull from exhaustion. They carried almost nothing. Some had small bundles, others nothing at all. None of them spoke. They just filed inside silently, their breaths clouding in the air like ghosts. The room, once empty and quiet, suddenly felt too small. The fire crackled louder, fighting to keep them all warm. Thomas stood there, unsure what to say. He hadn't seen another soul in months. He had come to this cabin after losing his brother in the war, hoping to be alone to forget. And now 12 war widows stood in his home, uninvited, unexplained. He moved automatically, fetching more blankets, boiling water, cutting slices of bread. The women moved quietly, helping each other, drying clothes by the fire. A few murmured prayers under their breath. One woman, older than the rest, looked around the cabin with sharp eyes, as if checking for danger. When they all settled, Thomas finally asked, "Where did you come from?" No one answered. The woman with the gray eyes, the first one, looked at him, but said nothing. He noticed a strange symbol stitched into her torn sleeve, 2 lines crossed by 3 smaller ones. Like a ladder. Later, when everyone had fallen asleep near the fire, Thomas went to bring more wood from the shed. The snow was still falling hard. As he stepped outside, his boot brushed against something. He looked down and saw the same symbol, the ladder, scratched into the snow near his door. He crouched down, brushing the snow aside. The mark was neat and deliberate, not the kind made by accident. He remembered seeing it once before, years ago, on crates of medical supplies during the war. Soldiers had said it marked safe routes, hidden shelters, places where you could find food or help. But why was it on his doorstep? He hadn't told anyone about this place. He straightened up and looked toward the tree line. For a moment, between the gusts of snow, he thought he saw movement, a shadow standing still among the trees, watching. Thomas's pulse quickened. He stepped back inside and bolted the door. The fire had dimmed, and the widows were asleep, their faces soft in the orange light. The room smelled of smoke, damp wool, and something else, fear. He took a seat by the window and pushed the curtain aside. The snow outside glowed faintly under the moon. Everything looked calm again, peaceful even. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe the storm was playing tricks on him, or still. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded, then set it beside his chair. The wind moaned through the chimney. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. He looked over. The woman with the gray eyes was awake, staring at him from across the room. "You should sleep," he said softly. She shook her head. "He's out there," she whispered. Thomas's throat went dry. Who? She didn't answer. She only turned toward the fire, her face unreadable. Hours passed. The storm began to fade, the wind dropping to a tired whisper. Thomas dozed off for a moment, the warmth making his eyelids heavy. That was when he heard a slow, deliberate knock. But this time, it didn't come from the door. It came from inside the house. He stood up fast, heart pounding. The widows stirred awake, their faces pale with fear. Somewhere behind the wall, the knock came again, 3 slow beats, steady and cold. Thomas grabbed the lantern and moved toward the sound. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The widows huddled close together, whispering prayers. He reached the far wall, the one behind his brother's old trunk. He pressed his ear against it. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, came the sound of breathing on the other side of the wall. Thomas stepped back slowly, gripping the lantern tighter. The storm outside was dying, but inside, something far worse had just begun. By morning, the storm had buried the world in white. The valley lay silent under a thick coat of snow, and Thomas's cabin looked like a small dark dot in a sea of ice. Inside, the 12 widows slept close to the fire, wrapped in his blankets, their breath forming faint clouds in the cold air. Only Thomas stayed awake. He sat by the window, watching the forest edge where he had seen the shadow the night before. Nothing moved, but the silence felt heavy, like something was waiting. He stood and began to light the oil lamp. "We need rules," he said. His voice was rough from hours without speaking. A few of the women stirred, blinking sleep from their eyes. "If we're all staying here, we have to live by order. There's food enough for maybe 2 weeks. Firewood for 3 if we're careful. Everyone helps, everyone eats." The gray-eyed woman nodded first. "Agreed." Her voice was calm but strong now. The others followed her lead, murmuring assent. One of them a young woman with a limp past, "And after the food runs out?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked toward the shuttered window. "Then we find a way," he said. But even he didn't believe his own words. They worked in silence through the morning. Some chopped wood, others melted snow for water. Thomas checked the pantry and counted each jar, marking the numbers in a small notebook. It gave him something to do, something that felt like control. The women seemed used to hardship, used to taking orders and keeping quiet. They didn't ask many questions, and when they spoke to each other, it was in whispers too low for him to hear. By afternoon, the cabin felt alive again. The smell of stew filled the air, and laughter flickered once or twice like small sparks. It almost felt normal, almost. Then Thomas noticed the marks. The young woman with the limp was hanging coats near the stove to dry. As she lifted one, a patch on the inside sleeve caught his eye. 2 vertical lines crossed by 3 short ones, just like the symbol he'd seen scratched into the snow outside. He froze. The same mark appeared again on another coat, burned faintly into the fabric. Like a brand, he walked over. "Where did you get these?" The women went still. The gray-eyed woman looked up slowly. "They're from before," she said. "Before what?" She didn't answer. Thomas looked at the others. They avoided his eyes, staring into the fire. "That mark, what does it mean?" He pressed. "It means safe passage," said the older widow, her voice trembling. "Or it used to." "Used to?" She nodded. "Now it means hunted." The room fell quiet. The only sound was the steady crackle of the fire. Thomas wanted to ask more, but the fear on their faces stopped him. He felt like an outsider in his own home. They knew something he didn't, something that kept them alive long enough to reach his door. That night, he lay awake on his cot, listening to the sounds of breathing and the shifting wood. He tried to tell himself the knocking he'd heard before was just the storm playing tricks, but then he remembered the breathing behind the wall. That had been real. Unable to sleep, he rose and went to the kitchen. The lantern's light threw long shadows on the floor. He poured water into a cup and sat down at the table. As he leaned forward, the table creaked under his elbow. Something about the sound made him pause. He lifted the tablecloth and looked underneath. There, burned into the underside of the wood, was the same mark, the latter symbol clear and dark, as if carved yesterday. His stomach turned. This cabin had belonged to his brother before the war. Thomas had only moved here after the funeral, trying to escape the noise of cities and the weight of memories. But if that mark was already here, it meant his brother had known these people, maybe even helped them. He ran his fingers over the burned wood, feeling the grooves. His brother had been part of a secret evacuation line helping women and children cross battle zones. But that mission had ended badly. Every record said the convoy disappeared in the mountains. Now 12 widows from that lost line were in his home. A soft voice came from behind him. "You found it." Thomas turned. It was the gray-eyed woman, wrapped in her blanket, standing in the doorway. "What were you doing with my brother?" he asked quietly. She stepped closer. "He saved us. Or tried to. He told us if everything failed, there was one last place to go. A house by the valley. A man who would keep us safe." Thomas's heart pounded. "He meant me." She nodded. "He said you'd understand the sign." He sat down heavily, the truth hitting him like cold water. His brother had sent them here after death, through a trail of symbols and whispers. "Who's hunting you?" he asked. Her eyes darkened. "A man who sells lives for gold. He followed us when we fled the camp. He knows this mark too." A gust of wind slammed against the shutters, and both of them turned toward the sound. For a heartbeat, the wind fell silent, replaced by a faint scraping noise. Someone or something was moving outside the window. Thomas grabbed the rifle and stepped toward the door. The gray-eyed woman caught his sleeve. "Don't go," she whispered. "He waits for the door to open." Thomas froze. The fear in her eyes was not the fear of a stranger, it was the fear of someone who had lived through hell and knew its shape. They stood there, listening. The scraping moved along the wall, slow and steady, until it stopped near the corner where the snow piled deep. Then, silence. Thomas looked down. The floorboards near the door were wet again. Snow had melted there in a thin, perfect line like footprints made from the inside. He realized then what terrified him most. Whoever or whatever was out there might not be waiting to get in. It might already be inside. By the third morning, the valley was silent again, the storm gone, leaving behind a frozen world of glittering white. But peace was only an illusion. Inside the cabin, unease had started to grow like mold in dark corners. The widows spoke in whispers now, glancing at the windows as if afraid the forest could listen. Thomas pretended not to notice, but every sound, the creak of a chair, the moan of the wind, the crackle of the fire set his nerves on edge. Sleep had become a stranger. The nights were filled with faint sounds, footsteps where there should be none, a soft tapping on the wall, and once, a low hum like a song from someone dreaming. Each morning, he found new signs: snow disturbed near the back door, boot prints that didn't match his or any of the women's. Something or someone was circling them. That morning, as he stoked the fire, the gray-eyed woman, her name, he'd learned, was Mara, sat across from him, sewing a torn glove. "You don't sleep," she said quietly. He shrugged. "Someone has to keep watch." She looked up. "You're thinking of your brother." He froze. "What do you know about my brother?" Mara hesitated, then said, "He was the reason we made it this far." Thomas looked away. His brother, Samuel, had been a field medic during the war, brave, reckless, and full of hope. He'd tried to build safe routes for civilians fleeing the front lines. Then one winter, his unit vanished. All they found were a few broken wagons and burned tracks. The army called it a raid. Thomas called it betrayal. He hadn't spoken of his brother in months, not to anyone. Yet these women carried traces of him, his mark, his kindness, his unfinished promise. After breakfast, while the widows went outside to gather wood, Thomas searched through his trunk. Under layers of old coats, he found a tin box, its metal cold against his hands. Inside were the letters, dozens of them, written to his brother, but never sent. Letters full of anger, regret, and guilt. Letters he couldn't burn, even though he'd tried. He sat by the window, reading them one by one. In one letter, he'd written, "You said we could still save people, Sam, but all I saw were bodies. How do you keep believing in a world that keeps breaking?" His eyes blurred. He almost closed the box when something slipped from the bottom, a folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age. Not one of his brother's handwriting. He unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a map, a rough sketch of mountain paths, with small symbols marking safe houses. The same ladder-like sign appeared over and over, leading straight toward a point labeled Last Refuge. Under it, a note: "If they reach you, don't turn them away. Trust the mark, and the one who carries it." Thomas's throat tightened. His brother had planned everything right down to this cabin. The widows weren't strangers. They were his brother's final rescue mission. A shadow fell over him. Mara stood behind, silent as snow. "You found it," she said softly. He turned the map toward her. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because the less you knew, the safer you were," she said. "The man hunting us doesn't just kill. He trades names. He finds people through their guilt." Thomas folded the map carefully. "Your hunter, who is he?" She hesitated. "They call him the Finder. He tracks the marks your brother made. He knows every safe path, every hiding place. And he wants something buried near this valley." "What could be worth all this death?" Mara's voice dropped. "Something your brother hid before he died. Something he didn't want anyone to find." Before Thomas could ask more, the door burst open. One of the younger widows stumbled in, face white as snow. "The tracks!" she cried. "They're back." Thomas rushed outside. The air burned his lungs with cold. Near the edge of the woods, half buried in snow, were footprints large, deep, made by boots. They circled the cabin, weaving between trees, then stopped near the shed. He followed the trail, rifle in hand. The shed door was ajar. Inside, the smell of smoke and oil hit him hard. A lantern lay shattered on the ground, its flame long dead. And there, hanging from a beam, was the same symbol again burned into the wood with a hot blade. But this one had something new. Beneath the latter mark, a single word was carved in shaky letters, "Ode." Thomas's pulse pounded in his ears. He backed out slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. Snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. He could feel eyes watching from the forest. Back inside, he found the map gone. "Who took it?" he demanded. The women looked at each other, confused or pretending to be. Mara stepped forward. "None of us," she said. But Thomas saw the flicker of fear behind her calm face. That night, no one spoke. The fire crackled low. The widows sat close, clutching their blankets. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the missing map. Someone had taken it. Someone inside the cabin. He went to his cot and lay down, pretending to sleep. Hours passed. Then he heard the faint sound of paper unfolding. His eyes opened a crack. Across the room, one of the women, young, with dark hair, was kneeling by the firelight, holding the map close to the flames. Her lips moved in a whisper he couldn't hear. Thomas rose quietly, every step careful on the wooden floor. As he reached her, the firelight caught her face tear-streaked, trembling. "Why?" he whispered. She jumped, clutching the map to her chest. "He said he'd spare us if I showed him the way," she said. "Who?" "The Finder. He's coming." Thomas's stomach dropped. "How soon?" Her voice broke. "Before dawn, outside," as if to answer her. A flare of red light burst in the sky above the forest, silent, bright, and terrible. Thomas stared at it through the window, the blood-colored glow painting the snow. The widows crowded behind him, gasping. The war, it seemed, had finally found them. And the night was far from over. Dawn came gray and hollow, the kind of light that looked tired before it even began. The red flare had burned out hours ago, but its echo still haunted the horizon. Thomas stood at the window, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the woods. The forest was still, too still, like it was holding its breath. He hadn't slept. None of them had. The widows sat by the dying fire, their faces pale and silent, waiting for something, maybe morning, maybe mercy. When the first weak sunlight touched the snow, Thomas stepped outside. The air bit at his skin. Every sound felt sharper, the crunch of his boots, the whistle of wind between trees. He followed the line of footprints left the night before. They led past the shed, curved around the cabin, and vanished halfway down the hill as if swallowed by the snow. He crouched, brushing at the ice. The prints didn't fade, they stopped. No sign of a struggle, no turn, no continuation. Just gone. He felt a cold trickle of fear slide down his spine. "Whoever's watching us," he muttered, "knows how to disappear." Behind him, Mara's voice carried softly from the porch. "He does more than disappear. He listens." Thomas turned. She stood wrapped in a wool blanket, her eyes on the tree line. "The Finder always knows where his prey hides," she said. "He leaves no tracks because he doesn't walk where men do. He studies the paths, the wind, the sound of a cough, a match being struck. He's patient." Thomas frowned. "You've seen him?" She nodded once. Once, only once. Long enough to wish I hadn't. He didn't ask for details. Her eyes already told the story, one of darkness, fire, and loss. They went back inside, locking the door behind them. Thomas laid out the remaining food on the table, half a sack of flour, a few jars of beans, dried herbs, 2 loaves gone hard at the edges. Not enough. We'll need to hunt, he said. No, Mara replied quickly. If you go into the woods now, you won't come back. Then we'll starve in here. He shot back. A quiet voice rose from near the fire. Better to starve together than die alone. It was the youngest widow, the one who had betrayed them to the finder. She hadn't spoken since the night of the flare. Now her hands trembled in her lap. He promised he wouldn't hurt you. I thought. Thomas cut her off. You thought wrong. His voice cracked sharper than he meant. He looked away. We'll get through this. But we need a plan. The older widow, the one with the white streak in her hair, cleared her throat. There's a ridge north of here. My husband used to hunt there. If we can reach it, we can see the valley. Thomas nodded slowly. When the snow softens, we move. Until then, the cabin became their prison. The hours dragged heavy. Every creak in the roof made someone flinch. Thomas tried to keep busy fixing the door hinges, sharpening the axe, watching the tree line through the frosted glass dot at dusk. He noticed something strange, a thin thread of smoke rising from beyond the ridge. He adjusted his view. It wasn't from their chimney. Someone else had made a fire, not far off. Too close, he grabbed the rifle and slipped outside before anyone could stop him. The cold hit him like a slap, but the silence was worse. He moved low, slow, leaving as few prints as possible as he reached the hill's crest. He saw an old hunter's blind made of snow and branches. Inside it, a small fire burned low, covered to hide the light. No figure, but there were footprints, large, deliberate, moving in a wide circle that came dangerously close to the cabin. Thomas's stomach tightened. Someone had been watching them all along from here. He was about to head back when something caught his eye, something buried half in the snow, near the blind. He brushed it off and froze. It was a piece of fabric, a torn corner of a woman's scarf. Green, Mara's scarf, heart-pounding. He sprinted back down the hill, slipping and sliding on the ice. When he burst into the cabin, the widows jumped. Mara was gone. Where is she? He demanded. The older widow pointed to the cellar. She went down there an hour ago. Said she needed to check something. Thomas ran to the trapdoor and pulled it open. Mara, no answer. He grabbed the lantern and climbed down the narrow ladder. The cellar was cold and damp, filled with the smell of old earth. The light flickered across rows of jars, tools, and crates. But at the far wall, something new caught his eye, a small door, half hidden behind stacked firewood. He'd never seen it before. He pushed the wood aside and knelt. The door was made of iron, small and rusted shut. Strange symbols were carved into the surface, old letters, and among them, the same ladder mark. His brother's sign. He felt a chill run deeper than the cold around him. His brother had built this. Why? Suddenly, movement flickered at the edge of the lantern light. A shadow. He turned fast, raising the rifle. Mara, she stepped out of the dark, her green scarf gone, her face pale. Don't open it, she said. Thomas's hands shook. You know what's behind this door? She nodded. Your brother's last secret. The reason the finder hunts us. What's inside? Her eyes filled with tears. Not what you think. Who? He didn't get to ask more. Above them, a loud crash shook the cabin floorboards. Shouts followed, panic, fear. The sound of glass breaking. Thomas grabbed Mara's arm. Stay here. He climbed the ladder 2 steps at a time and burst into chaos. The windows were shattered, the front door blown open by the wind. Snow swirled inside. The widows screamed as a flare of red light flashed just beyond the porch. Then came the sound, the long, low whistle that had haunted the night before. Thomas raised the rifle and aimed at the open doorway. Through the swirling snow, a figure stood tall, wrapped in white and shadow, and even though the storm howled between them, Thomas could swear the man smiled. The morning after the attack was a blur of smoke and silence. The snow outside was scarred with footprints and streaks of ash. The flare had burned itself out hours ago, leaving behind the faint smell of metal and fear. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy, thick with exhaustion, dread, and the unspoken knowledge that something had changed forever. Thomas moved among the broken glass and splintered wood, checking the windows. The widows huddled together near the fire, their faces pale and drawn. No one spoke. The world outside felt wrong, tilted somehow. Two of the women had minor cuts, another a bruised shoulder from where she'd been thrown by the blast of the door. But no one had died, not yet. Whoever had been outside had wanted to frighten them, not kill them. Not yet. Thomas rebarred the door and turned toward the trapdoor. The memory of the iron door beneath the cellar haunted him. He had seen the fear in Mara's eyes when she begged him not to open it. Whatever his brother had hidden down there, it wasn't gold, or maps, or weapons. It was worse. He lit a lantern and went down again. The air below was cold, stale, thick with the scent of old oil and earth. The iron door sat half hidden in the shadows, its carved symbols glinting in the light. He crouched beside it, tracing the edges with his hand. The metal was smooth, except where someone had carved a single new mark, a name. Sam. Thomas froze. His brother's name, not written by him, but by someone else, carved rough and desperate. He heard footsteps behind him. Mara's voice came soft and steady. He told me never to let anyone open it. Not until the war ended. Thomas turned. The war's been over for months. She shook her head. Not for everyone. He frowned. What's behind it, Mara? Tell me the truth. Her eyes glistened. Not what? Who? Your brother locked someone inside to save the rest. Thomas's stomach turned. You mean alive? Alive when he left, she whispered. He said the man had turned. That he was part of the hunts, feeding names to the finder. He couldn't kill him, so he sealed him down here. Thomas stared at the door, at the name scratched into it. His brother had always been the kind one, the one who saw good in everyone. But the war had changed people, broken them, twisted them. Could he really have imprisoned someone alive? He felt a chill deeper than the cold around him. And now, Mara looked at him. Now the finder wants what's in there. Proof, a name that would make him untouchable. Thomas's mind raced. The finder didn't hunt for survival or revenge, he hunted for secrets. Maybe this locked door held the biggest one of all. A sharp crack echoed from above. Both of them flinched. Thomas grabbed his rifle and climbed back up, lantern swinging. One of the windows had shattered inward. A stone lay on the floor, wrapped in a piece of cloth. He unwrapped it and froze. The cloth was one of their blankets, but stitched roughly into it were words written in black ink. Trade the cellar, save your lives. Mara read it over his shoulder, her face turning white. He knows. Thomas looked out the window, but the forest was still. Just snow, just quiet. The finder didn't need to shout. He made you feel hunted without showing his face. He turned to the others. We're leaving. The older widow shook her head. We can't move through that snow. He'll pick us off before we reach the ridge. Then we make our stand here, Thomas said. But if we die, we do it fighting. The women exchanged glances. They had seen too much war already, but something in his voice steadied them. For the first time since the storm began, there was purpose in the room. They worked quickly. Thomas blocked the lower windows with furniture, poured oil along the porch steps, and set traps near the doors. The widows gathered supplies, melted snow for water, and tied makeshift weapons from iron tools. By nightfall, the cabin looked less like a home and more like a fortress. The fire burned low and steady. As the wind rose again, Mara stood by the window. He won't stop, she said quietly. He doesn't want to kill us. He wants the man behind that door. Thomas's eyes went to the trapdoor. Then we give him something else to find. He took one of his brother's old maps and spread it across the table. The widows watched as he marked false trails, fake routes, symbols leading away from the valley. If the finder's spies were near, they'd see the decoy light. When the plan was set, the widows lay down to rest. Thomas stayed awake, staring at the door, the fire, and finally the cellar hatch. Sometime after midnight, the house creaked. He thought it was the wind until he heard a low murmur. Voices, not the widow's, deeper. Male. He crept to the trapdoor and lifted it just enough to peer down. Lantern light flickered below. Mara stood facing the iron door, whispering. Her hand rested against the rusted surface as though she were comforting someone inside. "Mara," he whispered sharply. She looked up, startled. "I wasn't. Who's in there?" Her face broke. "You don't understand. He's not a stranger." "Then who?" She hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, she said, "Your brother." The world tilted. Thomas stumbled back, shaking his head. "That's not possible. Sam died in the mountains." Mara's eyes filled with tears. "He didn't. He sealed himself inside to stop the finder from taking what he knew. He made me promise to keep him hidden. He said if I broke the seal, the line would die." Thomas felt the room spin around him. His brother alive, trapped for months, buried under his feet while he slept above. "Open it," he said hoarsely. Mara shook her head. "If you open that door, the finder will know. He's watching for the signal. That's why he's here." A sudden noise cut through the air, a static hum, faint but unmistakable. Thomas turned toward the old radio on the shelf. It had been dead since autumn. Now it crackled, came alive with a burst of sound. "Last refuge. Confirm location. Signal received." Thomas stared at it, heart pounding. The finder didn't need to knock anymore. He'd already found them. The night the radio spoke, the valley came alive with unseen eyes. Thomas smashed the dial off the table, but the damage was done. The signal had gone through. The finder now knew exactly where they were. The air in the cabin felt different, charged with a quiet panic. The widows gathered around the fire, their faces ghostly in the orange light. No one dared speak at first. It was Mara who broke the silence, her voice trembling. "He's coming tonight." Thomas stared at her. "How do you know?" She didn't answer right away. She just turned toward the frosted window. Beyond it, somewhere in the distance, a faint red glow blinked twice, paused, then once. It was a signal, a hunter's code. The cabin went still. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Thomas checked his rifle and looked at the widows. "We hold this place. We don't run. We've survived this long. We're not handing him anything." The older widow Elena shook her head. "You can't fight him, Thomas. He doesn't come alone." And she was right. Before dawn, faint shapes began to move across the snowfields, small, dark dots against the white, spreading out in a slow half-circle round the valley. The finder's men. Thomas counted 6, maybe more. They moved carefully, like wolves circling a den. He turned to the group. "Downstairs, all of you. Take what you need." Mara stepped forward. "What are you going to do?" He forced a tight smile. "Buy time." She reached for his arm. "You'll die. Not before he does," he said. But inside, he wasn't sure if he believed that. By midday, the siege had begun. The men stayed just out of sight, moving between trees, whispering to one another. Every so often, a flash of light glinted off glass's scope. A test, a warning. Thomas moved from window to window, keeping low. He saw no faces, just shifting shadows. The widows stayed below, silent, waiting. Every creak in the floor sounded like thunder. Hours dragged like days. The wind began to pick up, carrying snow through cracks in the walls. Thomas's eyes burned from lack of sleep. He'd known fear before, during battles, during loss, but this was different. This was waiting for a ghost to show itself. When night came, the first shot rang out. A bullet shattered the window beside him, spraying wood and glass. Thomas ducked, rolling behind the table. He aimed through the hole and fired back once, blindly. The echo cracked across the valley. Then silence again. He reloaded with shaking hands. "They're testing range," he muttered. Below, someone screamed. He raced down the ladder into the cellar. The lantern had fallen, rolling across the floor. One of the widows had a cut on her arm, not deep but bleeding fast. Mara pressed cloth against it. "They shot through the vent," she said, her voice tight. "They're aiming for sound." Thomas cursed under his breath. "We can't stay boxed in." He thought for a moment, then grabbed a coil of rope and his lantern. "There's a drainage tunnel under the cellar," he said. "It leads to the ravine. I sealed it years ago, but maybe." Elena's eyes widened. "That tunnel's old. It'll collapse. Then it'll collapse behind us," Thomas replied. He crouched and began breaking away the frozen earth near the back wall. The widows joined in, clawing and scraping at the dirt until the faint outline of a tunnel appeared, in narrow crawl space, lined with stone. The smell of cold earth and rot wafted up. As they worked, the gunfire started again, closer now. Shots pinged against the walls above. Snow poured in from the broken windows. "They're moving in," Mara said. Thomas turned to her. "When I say run, you take them through that tunnel. Don't stop until you reach the ridge." She grabbed his sleeve. "You're not staying." He looked at her for a long moment. "Someone has to make them believe we're still inside." Her eyes filled with tears. "I can do it." He shook his head. "You've done enough. You got them this far." There was a moment of silence between them, heavy with everything they didn't have time to say. Then Thomas took a deep breath and climbed the ladder, upstairs. The cabin was a storm of smoke and splintered wood. He could see flashes of movement through the windows, figures creeping closer. The finder's men had spread out completely now, closing in from both sides. Thomas moved to the door and unbarred it slowly. The wood creaked. Snow swept in as he opened it, just a crack. He could see the nearest man clearly now, white coat, rifle raised, face hidden behind goggles. Thomas stepped out with his hands raised. "Enough," he shouted. "You want me? I'm here." The man stopped. Another shadow moved behind him. Then, out of the darkness, a tall figure emerged. No goggles, no rifle. Only a long coat and a face pale as ash. The finder, even from a distance, his presence was heavy, magnetic. His eyes, sharp and cold, caught the faint light from the lantern. "You have something of mine," he said. His voice was smooth, calm, too calm. Thomas gritted his teeth. "Whatever's in that cellar stays there." The finder tilted his head slightly. "That's not for you to decide." Then, almost casually, he lifted his hand. His men stepped forward. Before they could fire, a roar filled the air, a deep, rumbling crack. Behind the cabin, the ground shifted. The tunnel. Thomas turned, realizing what Mara had done. Smoke billowed from the back of the house. He ran inside and down the ladder. The cellar was half collapsed, earth raining from above. The widows were gone. The tunnel had caved in behind them. Only Mara stood there, waiting. "You were taking too long," she said, breathless. Thomas grabbed her arm. "We need to go." But as he turned toward the ladder, a shadow filled the doorway above them. The finder stood there, calm and silent, snow melting on his boots. "You opened the door for me," he said softly. Thomas raised his rifle, but the man didn't flinch. His gaze drifted toward the iron door at the back of the cellar. "You've kept my secret safe long enough." Mara moved in front of it, trembling. "You can't have him." The finder smiled faintly. "Oh, Mara, I already do." And with that, he reached for the lock. The metal groaned. The door began to open, and from the darkness inside came the sound of breathing, familiar, human, and heartbreakingly alive. The iron door opened with a sound that was half scream, half metal giving way after too many winters of silence. Cold air rushed out from the dark beyond, thick and heavy, carrying with it the smell of rust, damp earth, and something else, something alive. Thomas stepped forward, heart pounding in his chest. The lantern flame flickered wildly, throwing shapes across the cellar walls. The finder stood just beyond the threshold, a calm figure in the storm of chaos, eyes locked on the open darkness inside the hidden chamber. A man sat slumped against the far wall, bound by iron shackles that had bitten deep into his wrists. His beard was long, streaked with gray, and his face was thin, ghost-like. But the eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. "Sam," Thomas whispered, voice cracking like dry wood. The man stirred, blinking slowly as if waking from a long sleep. When he spoke, his voice was faint but sure. "You took your time, little brother." Thomas staggered back a step, tears burning hot behind his eyes. "They told me you were dead." "I was," Sam said. "At least, the part of me that believed in mercy." Mara's hand trembled at her side. She had tears on her cheeks, but her face stayed firm. "He saved us," she whispered. "All of us." The finder moved closer, the faint smile never leaving his lips. "And yet, you kept him buried like a secret. You don't even know what he's become." Thomas raised his rifle. "Stay back." The finder's eyes glinted. "Your brother isn't who you think he is. Ask him what happened to the last convoy. Ask him why 12 widows walked out of fire when 50 others didn't." Thomas's grip tightened on the gun. He wouldn't, but Sam's voice cut through the room, raw and quiet. "He's telling the truth. The world seemed to tilt. The air felt too thin to breathe. "What do you mean?" Thomas whispered. Sam looked up, his eyes full of ghosts. "The convoy was a trap. They found us because of me. I thought it was saving them, feeding false trails to the enemy so our people could escape. But every lie I told led someone else to their deaths. When I realized, it was too late." He took a shaky breath. "The finder was one of ours once. A soldier. He saw what I'd done and turned it into profit. He took the mark, the roots, everything I built to help people and sold them to the highest bidder." Thomas shook his head. "No, Sam, Sam's voice cracked. "I deserve this. That's why I stayed behind. To make sure no one else carried the curse of my name." The finder stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the floor. "He's the last key, Thomas. You open that door fully, and the truth comes with him. The proof he wrote in those logs down here records of every betrayal, every name he traded. The governments would pay in gold for what your brother knows." Mara moved between them, trembling but fierce. "He's not a weapon, he's a man." The finder tilted his head. "Everyone's a weapon, if you use them right." Thomas fired. The rifle cracked loud in the small space, the sound slamming off stone walls. The finder stumbled back, the lantern light catching the spray of dust and blood. For the first time, his calm broke. Mara screamed. Thomas dropped the gun, ears ringing. Smoke curled around the room, mixing with the smell of oil and iron. But the finder only smiled again, faint and slow, blood seeping through his coat. "You think it ends with me?" he said softly. "The trail doesn't die, it waits." He stumbled backward toward the ladder, then disappeared up it into the storm. For a moment, only silence filled the cellar. Thomas turned to Sam. "We're getting you out." Sam shook his head weakly. "Don't. The world doesn't need me again. It needs to forget." But Thomas ignored him. He found a rusted key on the wall and forced it into the lock. The shackles broke loose with a cry of metal. Sam collapsed into his arms, bones light as driftwood. "We have to move," Mara said. "He's not dead. He'll come back." Thomas helped his brother up the ladder, step by step, until they reached the main room. The fire had burned down to embers. The widows stood near the walls, clutching blankets and bags, ready to flee. Elena looked at Sam and gasped. "It's true," she whispered. "You were the one who marked the paths." Sam nodded slowly. "And the one who led the hunters." No one spoke. The truth lay heavy in the room, too real to deny. Thomas turned to the group. "We can't stay here. The ridge, there's an old outpost near the river. We'll make it there before dawn." They moved quickly, wrapping themselves in scarves, gathering what they could carry. When they stepped outside, the night was eerily calm. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. Stars shone above the valley like 1,000 watchful eyes. They walked in silence, every crunch of snow sounding like thunder in the stillness. Behind them, the cabin stood small and dark, smoke trailing weakly from its chimney. Halfway up the ridge, Sam stopped. "Thomas," he said softly. "I can't go." Thomas turned. "Don't start this again." Sam smiled faintly. "I mean it. He'll follow me. He always does. But if I stay, if I burn the trail, maybe the rest of you can go free." Thomas's chest ached. "You're not dying here, not again." Sam placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "You have a chance to save what's left. Let me pay for what I broke." Before Thomas could argue, Sam took the lantern from his hand and started back down the hill, moving with a quiet steadiness that broke Thomas's heart. Moments later, a bloom of light flared behind them, fire swallowing the cabin, the sky turning gold against the snow. The explosion echoed through the valley, followed by silence. Mara stood beside Thomas, tears shining on her cheeks. "He ended it," she said. Thomas stared at the flames. "No," he whispered. "He began something new." As dawn rose over the ridge, the snow began to thaw. The widows stood together, holding hands. They had lost everything, yet for the first time, their faces showed peace. When they reached the outpost, they made a new sign on the door. 2 long lines crossed by 3 short ones, the ladder mark. But this time, beneath it, Thomas carved one more word: home.